Hi guys, Erin here. This week is a launching point for the rest of our course. You're going to get an overview of the 5 quantitative research strategies in the other video, which we're going to develop and describe in more detail throughout the rest of our course. And you're also going to learn about a central theme in our course, internal and external validity. So here's where this video fits into the context of our course and the research process. In this video, you're going to understand, hopefully, what is internal and external validity, so what it is and why they're so important in allowing us to be able to trust the conclusions of a study and see that it generalizes and we can apply those conclusions to us and to our people. So let's get started. In previous weeks, we talked about measurement validity and measurement reliability, which are all about the assessment tools that we use and whether the test actually tests what we think it's testing and whether it does it in a very consistent way. So we'd want something like this situation. So these are about the assessment tools, but what about the whole study? Validity in a research study is about whether we can trust and apply the conclusions of a study. Internal validity, so you can think of within the study, is about the extent to which the study answers the questions it intended to answer and does so without bias. An ideal study with high internal validity would be a highly controlled research study, so maybe an experiment or a quasi-experiment that actively avoids alternative explanations for the results. External validity is about the extent to which studies generalize beyond the study to other contexts. So you can think external to the study. An ideal study with high external validity would involve a representative sample of participants tested at a typical time and doing typical things. In an ideal world, a well-designed study would try to have as high as possible external and internal validity. External validity follows quite closely from what we talked about last week when we talked about sampling participants. And we said that we would want to have a representative sample of participants that represents our population. So unlike this sample that only represents some of the population, we would want to ensure that we have the others represented as well. That's one feature of external validity. External validity is about the extent to which we can generalize the results of people that were tested in one study doing this one thing in this one context, and whether we can trust that the conclusions from that study are also going to apply outwards and generalize to other people tested in other contexts doing other things. So any threat to external validity would be features of the study that limit our ability to generalize the results of the conclusion. So having, for example, a non-representative sample doing non-representative tasks. That's external validity. Internal validity is the extent to which we can be sure that there's one unambiguous explanation for the relationship between two variables. Often in quantitative research, we're examining the relationship between two variables. And so we want to avoid a situation where another factor that we're not interested in and that we're not studying could interfere with our ability to draw conclusions about the relationship between those two variables. And we're going to talk about this a lot throughout the course, and we'll give them the term of confounding variables. So here's our definition of these two kinds of validity. This is all very theoretical, so I thought I would give you an example to help illustrate what is external validity and internal validity and how to look for it in a research study and why they're so important. And I thought I'd use this example. I'm going to pose a question to you. Does too much time on screens decrease our mental health? What do you think? Well, we're all on screens a lot these days, and mental health conditions like anxiety and depression are also at a record high. Is this a causal relationship? Is time on screens causing our decreased mental health? Well, it turns out this relationship is pretty complex to study. A lot of research has been done looking into it. Here's a review from The Guardian about one study that found that there could, in fact, be a positive relationship and that social media, well, they conclude that it may affect girls' mental health and it might do so larger than boys. And so this relationship between social media and mental health might exist and might exist differently for boys and girls. The Guardian, by the way, just as an aside, is a great resource for a secondary resource for information from research. So it's free, it's trustworthy, it tends to involve a summary of a study and interviews the main author. You can then use this as a launching point to actually find that study and read the study for yourself. So it's a really great place to start for ideas for your own research, for example, for this course, for your research proposal. So this study finds that there's a relationship. Here's another study, is a review of a book suggesting that this relationship might actually be more complex than we think it is, and just banning cell phone use and screen time in general is not going to solve our mental health crisis. Here's a podcast talking about it, really great podcast, reviewing the evidence to date and giving some great suggestions for future research that should be done to better understand this relationship. Here's another secondary resource from Psychology Today that talks about another study that was published looking at the relationship between screen time in kids and psychological well-being. This is great because it gives us a link to the original study. Whenever possible, you want to look to the original study for your research proposal. You'll definitely have to do this because you want to be able to determine for yourself if this secondary report is actually accurately representing that study. For the purpose of this video, we're going to look at that study, and we'll talk about whether we can trust conclusions, follow logically from what was tested. So this is about the internal validity, and whether we can trust that the results are also going to generalize to other people and places and doing different things, which is about the external validity. So if we go to Google Scholar, we can find this article, and you'll see that it's been cited a lot. This is a great indication that this might be an article that we can trust. Other people have cited it, or it's at least been foundational in the research world. And so this might be something you want to consider when choosing which articles to include in your research proposal. So if we go to Google Scholar, we have the study here. Let's just chat for a minute about how we read a research article efficiently. We want to inhibit our natural tendency to read it top to bottom. Instead, you want to do it very strategically, where you read the highlights, the abstract, which is going to give you the summary of the whole study. You then want to jump down to the last paragraph of the introduction. It's going to tell you the purpose of the study and what is unique about this study compared to others. And then importantly, before you read the results, you want to read the first paragraph of the discussion. It's going to lay out what the most important results are and how they answer the research questions. This is really helpful so you don't get lost in the details. Finally, you could jump to the end and read the conclusion, which also gives you the implications. You always want to do this before you then read the study in detail. For the purpose of this discussion, let's jump to the methods and talk about external validity. So this is about whether the results found with these people tested in this way can also generalize and provide conclusions that are applicable to us. So in this study, many children were tested. This is a population-based study where a survey was given to many people. This is great in terms of external validity because the researchers haven't selected who is going to participate in the study. It decreases the selection bias. We can feel more confident that the results are going to generalize to more people. We want to look at the ages of participants. We got a big range, so results are going to probably generalize to most children and teens, but probably not to old people like me. You want to look at who was excluded. In this case, it means that the results are going to generalize to typically developing kids, but likely not to kids with different neurodiversities. And importantly, you also want to look at the ethnic group of the participants. Like most studies, unfortunately, the majority of participants in this study are white. So it begs the question about whether the results are going to generalize to other ethnicities, and it points to perhaps a gap that future studies could fill. Now we want to look at the context of the study. So how the kids were tested, where they were tested, what time of when they were tested. So this study was done in the States, so likely the results are going to generalize to Canada. You always want to look at what country the study was done in and think about the culture, the system of supports that are available to families there, and decide for yourself whether you can generalize that the context, whether you think that the context there also generalizes and applies to us. The time of, so when the study was conducted might raise a bit of a red flag. This is a study looking at technology use, which is changing a lot very quickly. This study was done before the pandemic and before the launch of social media platforms like TikTok, well, at least before they became widely available. So this we want to maybe hold with a grain of salt that the results may or may not generalize to how young people interact with screens today. Now we want to look at the measurements. So what was tested? In this study, parents filled out a survey where they answered lots of questions to pertain to screen time, where they had to say how much time their children spent watching TV or playing video games and on an average weekday, and how much time they spend on computers, cell phones, and other devices. So they're asking about weekdays, not on weekends. So the results are not going to generalize to how kids interact with screens when they have more downtime. So this might be something that you want to consider if you're thinking about a question that pertains to a different time of the day. Also, parents are reporting how much their kids are interacting with screens on a regular basis. So this is actually quite good for external validity because we're reporting on what kids actually do in real life situations. This is better than, say, an experiment where kids come into the lab and we maybe measure how much time they spend on screens, which may or may not be representative of what they actually do. So this is pretty high in external validity. Although you could ask, are parents really accurate in how much screen time their kid actually used? Another study that maybe reports using the device itself, how many hours kids spend on that device and doing what, that might complement this study. The results from this study may or may not generalize to other methods of testing screen time use. Finally, we're reporting how much time kids spend in general on the screens, and the study is not asking what kids are actually doing on the screen. Other studies suggest what people do on the screens has a big impact on about how we feel. And you can think about that for yourself. You know, if you're watching an exercise video or you're talking with friends or family on FaceTime, that maybe after an hour of that, you maybe feel different than after an hour of scrolling through social media. So because the study is not asking about that, our results might be pretty variable here. And also we don't know whether the results are going to generalize to other ways that you or the people that you're interested in engage in screens. So this might be a limit in terms of the external validity because they didn't ask that. So altogether, I'd say this study, though, is pretty high in external validity, especially because we've got such a representative sample of participants. Although clearly there are some gaps that future studies could fill. All right, now let's talk about internal validity. So for this, we want to look at how the study was done, so what the research design is, what the results are, what the conclusions are that the authors drew from the results, and whether we can trust that the conclusions follow from what they actually did. So you want to look, first of all, at the design of the study. In this study, we had parents again fill out how much time the kids spend on their devices. And from that, the researchers made groups of kids and looked to see if the kids differ in terms of other measures of their psychological well-being. So parents also filled out questions about how the children, say, interact with others, how difficulty making friends, how much they argue, things like that. So we're comparing groups of kids that already exist in the world to see if there's a difference between groups. This is an example of a non-experiment, which we're going to learn about in future weeks tend to have lower internal validity. And I'll show you why that's the case now. So let's jump to the results. Our main results is just describing how much screen time kids in this study use as a function of how old they are. Again, these results may or may not generalize to how much time kids spend on screens today, now that more social media platforms are available to them. Okay, so parents filled out how much time kids spend on screens and how they perform on these different questions, like how curious they are, difficulty making friends, etc. I'm going to scroll down to figure 5, but all the results are basically saying a similar thing. Here we have the percentage of kids where parents say they argue too much as a function of how much time they spend on screens and how old they are, these different colors here. So one of the main conclusions from this study are that kids that are on screens a lot, so more than 7 hours a day, tend to their parents tend to report that they have lower psychological well-being. So in this case, they tend to argue too much. So we've got about 40% of kids who are on screens more than 7 hours a day. Their parents say they argue too much. So I'd like just to pause for a sec here and take this in. These kids are on screens for more than 7 hours a day on a weekday. So basically from the moment they come home from school to the moment they go to bed. So this makes me wonder, are there other factors that could be at play? Are the parents working and this is why the kids are on screens so much? Are they going to bed really late and that's how they can fit in so much screen time? There's no room for extracurricular activities, so it makes me wonder how much exercise they're getting. These are all examples of what we're going to term confounding variables. Third variables, other variables that we're not measuring in this study that could also impact psychological well-being, and that may also differ between our groups in an important way. So the kids that are on the screen more are probably also the kids that are not getting as much sleep, are not having as much healthy interactions with their family, are not getting as much exercise. In this kind of design, we can't rule out the possibility that it's those other variables that are playing the important role. So we don't know, is it the screens per se and the time on screens that's causing kids to have lower psychological well-being, or is it the time that they're not doing other healthy things that's contributing to their poor psychological well-being? Throughout the course, we're going to term this the third variable problem, and it's a huge threat to internal validity. In this kind of design, because we're not controlling for those other factors, we can't rule them out. The study has low internal validity. I'm going to show you one more result, which is another one of the main findings of the study. In this study, they're reporting the percentage, in this graph, they're reporting the percentage of kids who have been diagnosed with an anxiety disorder or with depression as a function of their age and the time on screens. And one of the big findings from this study is that kids who are on screens a lot are more likely, twice as likely to be diagnosed with an anxiety disorder compared to kids that are not. There's another challenge with this study. Because we're measuring psychological well-being and screen time at the same time, we don't know what is the chicken or what's the egg, what's the cause and what's the effect. It could be that being on screens causes kids to be more anxious, but it could also be that kids who are more anxious tend to spend more time on screens. This is called the directionality problem. We don't know what is the direction of the effect. It's a huge challenge for internal validity and makes it really hard for us to say that it's the screen time that's causing a decrease in our mental health. In this kind of design where we're not controlling for previous history of mental health conditions or we're not measuring our two variables at different points in time in a controlled way, we have no way of ruling this out. So this makes the study pretty low in internal validity for that reason as well. So conclusions from this study are that there is a relationship between screen time and mental health, but we just don't know if it's a causal relationship. The study is pretty high on external validity, but it's pretty low on internal validity. So we have to be very careful drawing a causal conclusion from this study. So what can we conclude? Does too much time on screens decrease our mental health? Well, probably it plays a role, but the direction of the effect is unclear, and the role of other factors like sleep and exercise is also unclear too. We'll be talking about this a lot more throughout this course and about how the research design or the way the study is done may or may not allow us to control for confounds or challenges to these cause and effect relationships that could provide an alternative explanation for the results. When you're reading research studies, you always want to ask yourself, could there be other variables at play that could also account for the relationship seen here? What we can conclude from this study is that those who report more screen time use tend to also report lower psychological well-being. So we should still be concerned. But because other variables may play a role, like sleep and exercise, we really shouldn't go out and ban screens completely. We need more research to better understand this relationship. More research is also needed to better understand who is most at risk. Are there differences? Does the role of screen time and our mental health differ depending on who we are? And we also need to know, when is this relationship most clear and in terms of engaging in what kind of screen use? So here's a picture of my two boys playing video games together. You can see from the look on the face that although they're playing video games, this was really a great chance for them to bond and interact with each other. So collapsing across all screen time might make it more difficult for us to understand the relationship between screen time and our mental health. Other research is needed too. So highly controlled experimental studies with high internal validity could complement those studies that we just showed before, those population-based studies that have high external validity. So for example, we could have kids come into the lab and engage in social media use, but we could manipulate their platforms or what they see on their platforms and look to see if that impacts their mental health. So people have suggested, for example, that the like count on Instagram could be particularly have negative effects, particularly for teenage girls. Well, we could actually do a study to look at that, to see the effect of different features of our platforms, to see how they affect our mental health. So maybe this will give you an idea for your research proposal. So external validity is about the extent to which we can generalize the results of a research study to people, places, times, measures, features that were not used in that study. An ideal situation would be a representative sample of participants tested at a typical time doing typical real-world things. My son is right there telling me he wants to get off the screen too. Give me 1 minute, okay, buddy? Any threat to the external validity would be the feature of a study that limits the ability to generalize the results or the conclusions. So for a study to have high external validity, you want to look to the participants and say, are they representative of the population? What are the procedures? Are they representative of real life situations? And what are the measurement tools and contexts that were studied? And do we think that we would get similar results if we use different tools and in different contexts? Internal validity is about the extent to which we can be sure that there's one ambiguous explanation for the relationship between two variables. For a study to have high internal validity, there really should only be one and only one explanation for the results. An ideal situation in terms of internal validity would be a highly controlled study that actively avoids alternative explanations for the results in the design or in the statistics, where we've actively tried to control for confounding variables. So confounding variable, as we'll talk about more throughout the course, is any variable in the study that is not something that we're interested in, that varies with the variables that we are interested in, and that could provide an alternative explanation for the relationship. In the future, we're going to talk about quasi-experiments and experiments, how they actively work towards decreasing confounding variables, making sure that they don't have an effect on the results. And we'll talk about how this often allows for the study to have higher internal validity compared to correlation and non-experiments that don't do this. In the meantime, check out your textbook, because they talk in a little bit more detail about some threats to internal validity that you want to avoid when looking at research studies, and for you to think about as you're designing your own research proposal. So It's really a balance. To control for all possible compounds in a study, the study has to be really highly controlled. However, this sometimes also moves it further away from real world situations. So sometimes when a study tries to increase the internal validity, it also decreases the external validity and vice versa. So, quality research is about thinking about what are the possible threats, both to internal and external validity, identifying what are the most serious threats, and actively trying to avoid them so that you can answer your specific research questions. All the while remembering that research builds upon other research. So maybe your study may not be able to have perfectly high internal and external validity, but you can work towards building upon what's been done before and increasing both of these kinds of validity to the best extent possible. As an example, check out these links for other studies that also address the same research question, but that try to do so in a way that increase the internal validity of that study. So to summarize, research validity is about how true or accurate the conclusions of a study are, and also whether we can trust that they apply to other people and contexts. Any factor that raises doubt about the conclusions, or the way they've been interpreted, or the way we can generalize them is a threat to validity. As a great chance to see if you've understood all of this, see if you can fill in these two blanks. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you in the next video.